In the spring of 1877, in a rented brick house on the edge of a small Iowa town, Charles and Caroline Ingalls welcomed a baby girl. The published Little House books skip that town, and that year entirely. Her name was Grace. Her birth falls inside a stretch of family history the published books never mention. The gap is real, but it does not prove hostility toward Grace. It is simply where this story begins. That gap in the story, the one her own family's books never went back to fill, is where this film begins tonight. If you're settling in for this one, go ahead and tap subscribe so more of these find you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. And for old Prairie recipes, homestead life, and more stories from the Ingalls world, visit prairiesecrets.com. If you're watching on TV, scan the QR code on your screen. If you're listening on your phone, you'll find the link in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you for being here. Get comfortable. It's all right to fall asleep. So, let's go back. Back to the Ingalls family, mid-move, in the autumn of 1876. Let's take our time with this one. By the time Charles and Caroline Ingalls settled into a rented brick house in Burr Oak, Iowa, they had already been moving for months. They had left Walnut Grove behind. They had spent time with relatives near Zumbro Falls, Minnesota. Their son, Charles Frederick, always called Freddie, had been born the year before in 1875, and he died in infancy near Zumbro Falls at about 9 months old, sometime in 1876. The exact circumstances remain thin, reported mostly through researcher accounts rather than a single confirmed document, and we'll leave it there, the way the family itself eventually had to. By autumn, the Ingalls family had reached Burr Oak. For a while they helped run a hotel there. Then they moved into a rented house of their own, the little red brick house that would become, for a short season, simply home. And it was there, on the 23rd of May, 1877, in that small rented house, that Grace Pearl Ingalls was born. If you know the Little House books well, you already sense the problem. The published series, the one that made this family famous around the world, tells the story of the Ingalls family leaving Wisconsin, then Minnesota, then jumping ahead to South Dakota, to the town of Smet, and the setting of By the Shores of Silver Lake. Burr Oak isn't in there, Freddie isn't in there, and Grace's actual arrival into the world isn't in there either. The books simply resume the story later, in a different place, with Grace already a small child, already present, already part of the family, with no chapter explaining how she got there. That's the literal fact behind the title of this account. Grace was born during a stretch the published record of her own family skips entirely. We do have another source though, one written by Laura Ingalls Wilder herself, years before the published novels existed. In an early manuscript called Pioneer Girl, meant originally for adult readers and never published in her lifetime, Laura described this exact period in her own words. She wrote about the family finding a little red brick house, and then, in her own phrasing, I found a new little sister. We named her Grace. Laura's own account tells us she did remember Burr Oak. She wrote about it once. She just didn't carry it into the books that would make her and her family famous. Why not? We can't say for certain. What we can say is that autobiographical children's book series from this era commonly compressed and reordered a family's real chronology for the sake of narrative flow. A publisher wants a clean arc, a manageable cast, a steady sense of place, a story that moves forward without doubling back to explain a rented house in a town the readers will never visit again. None of that requires anyone to have meant any harm. It simply means a real lived year, one that included a birth and a death, got left on the workshop floor when the books were built. So here is where Grace enters this story, not as a character introduced with fanfare, the way Mary or Laura or Carrie are, but as a fact of biology first. A baby born into a family already worn thin by loss and travel, in a town that would later vanish from her own sisters telling of their lives. She doesn't know any of this yet, of course. She's an infant. She cannot know that the family's most famous chronicler has already, quietly, left her earliest home out of the record. That absence isn't hers. It belongs to the books, not to the life, and the life is what we're here to follow. Grace enters the published series already present in the family, with the Burr Oak years and her birth left outside the narrative. Readers meet her after the beginning of her own life has already passed. It is a small structural oddity in a beloved series, easy to read past without noticing, and it sits at the centre of this story. None of this means Laura disliked her younger sister, or meant to erase her. She wrote about Burr Oak once, in her own hand, in a manuscript meant for adult readers rather than children, and simply never carried that material into the published series that made the family's name a household one. Whatever her reasons, they aren't preserved for us to read. What we can say is that the published books, the ones most people mean when they say they grew up on Little House, begin Grace's public existence somewhere in the middle, without ever doubling back to explain how she arrived. It's a small thing to notice, and an easy thing to miss on a first reading. But once you know to look for it, the shape of it doesn't go away. Grace is present in the books from her very first mention onward, and yet the book that could have introduced her properly simply never does. That's the plain, checkable shape of the missing years this account takes its starting point from. Not a mystery to be solved with speculation, but a documented gap sitting quietly at the front of a very famous family's very famous story, waiting for someone to walk back through it properly. Grace's birth date and location are solid ground, confirmed independently through more than one line of research, not resting on a single fragile claim. The manuscript passage adds texture and confirms Laura's own memory of the place, but the birth itself doesn't depend on it. It's firmer footing than much of what follows tonight, and it's worth saying once before the record starts to thin out. But a birth without a chapter doesn't erase a family's actual movements that year, and those movements are on the record. The Ingalls family didn't stay in Burr Oak for long. According to researcher accounts, the hotel work had been unsteady, money was tight, and the town never held the family the way Walnut Grove or, later, Smet would. Within roughly 2 years, Charles Ingalls was looking west again, back toward the Minnesota land the family had left, and eventually further still toward the Dakota territory that would define the rest of their lives. Grace was too young to remember any of it, but she was there for it, carried along through the same uncertain stretch of road that shaped her older sister's childhoods, the same wagon seats, the same unfamiliar towns passing outside canvas or glass. Whatever Burr Oak had been, brief, difficult, financially thin, it was also the true beginning of Grace's own particular version of the family story, even if nobody wrote it down at the time in a form that survives. It's a hard year to sit with, honestly. A son lost, a hotel venture that didn't hold, a family trying one town and then another. That kind of movement was, in truth, fairly ordinary for families on the frontier in this decade. Running a hotel required steady foot traffic and steady capital, and a small Iowa town coming off a difficult stretch of its own couldn't always supply either. Charles Ingalls was, by every account, a capable and hard-working man, and Burr Oak's difficulties reflect the harshness of the moment far more than any failing of his own. Grace was born into that ordinary, difficult, moving kind of life, the kind that rarely survives intact in family storytelling, but shaped nearly every household like hers on the plains at the time. By the time the family reached Walnut Grove again for a second stretch, and then finally made their way to the new railroad town of Smet in Dakota territory, Grace was no longer an infant carried through someone else's decisions. She was becoming a small, present, real child in a real place, the same Smet that would anchor half of her sister's published books. The road that got her there was longer and harder than the books ever say, though it ended at last somewhere the family would stay for good. 2 moves, 2 states, and a household rebuilding itself more than once, all before Grace was old enough to remember any of it. That's the actual shape of her earliest years, whatever the published chapters choose to show instead. It's worth naming, too, what this stretch of road actually demanded of a family like the Ingalls. Every move meant packing a household onto a wagon, finding new shelter, and starting over economically, sometimes more than once in a single year. Families on the frontier absorbed that kind of disruption constantly, and the Ingalls family's version of it, while harder than most in this particular stretch, wasn't unusual in kind. What made it matter for this account is simply that Grace was carried through the middle of it, arriving in Dakota territory already having lived through more upheaval than her age would suggest. None of that upheaval appears in the version of this family most people already know. The published books pick the story back up once the family is settled, established, and moving toward the more stable years that would define the series. The rougher stretch in between, the one Grace was actually born and carried through, simply isn't part of that telling. It doesn't need to be treated as tragic or hidden. It just needs to be said plainly once, and carried forward as we move to where Grace actually grew up. The family didn't stay in Burr Oak. Within 2 years they were on their way west again, and this time Grace went with them. Grace's childhood in and around Smet is, in one sense, the most familiar territory in this entire story, and in another sense, the least documented. If you grew up on the Little House books, you already carry images of this town in your head. The schoolhouse, the general store, the long winters. What the record actually tells us about Grace herself, specifically during these years, is comparatively thin. The family settled near Smet in the late 1870s, part of the wave of homesteaders drawn west by the railroad and the promise of open land. Grace grew up there, alongside a town that was quite literally growing up at the same time she was. According to researcher compilations, she attended the local school as she came of age, the same kind of one-room schoolhouse education that shaped so many children on the northern plains in that era. We won't walk back through the familiar scenes here, the blizzards, the schoolhouse dances that fill the published books so vividly. You likely already know them. What matters for Grace's own story is simpler. She was a real, present, growing child in a real, present, growing town, living a documented life that ran alongside the fictionalized version her sister would later write for the world. Smet itself was, in these years, still a genuinely new town, barely older than Grace herself, growing up around the railroad the way so many Dakota Territory towns did in this period. A schoolhouse, a handful of storefronts, homesteads spreading out across the surrounding claim land, all of it still raw and half-finished while Grace was small. By the time she was old enough to notice her surroundings clearly, the town and the girl were, in a real sense, growing up together, each one a little more established with each passing year. In the published books, young Grace is given the nickname Blue Eyes by her family, a warm, affectionate detail readers remember fondly. That detail comes from the books themselves, from Laura's crafted narrative voice, not from an independent record of what the family actually called her, day to day. It may reflect something true and lived, or it may be, at least in part, a novelist touch. We'll let the nickname stay where it belongs, inside the books, and keep our own account here to what the historical record can support. Whichever it was, Grace's actual childhood in this stretch left behind less of a paper trail than almost any other period of her life we'll cover tonight. A relocation record, a schooling record, and little else. It's the thinnest chapter in an otherwise gradually thickening story, and it stays that way here rather than being filled in with borrowed scenes from the books. That thinness is itself worth sitting with briefly before we move past it. A child growing up inside a family that would later become internationally famous still generated, for herself specifically, almost no independent paper trail during these years. Fame arrived later, and arrived around Laura, not around the household as a whole. Grace's own childhood was recorded the way most rural children's childhoods were recorded in this era. Barely at all, unless something unusual happened to bring a name into print. The same held true for most of her neighbours and classmates in that Smet schoolhouse. Ordinary childhoods on the Dakota frontier simply didn't generate much paperwork, famous family or not. What makes Grace's case worth a documentary's attention isn't that her childhood was uniquely undocumented. It's that everyone assumes it must be documented somewhere, given whose sister she was, and the honest answer is that it mostly isn't. That schoolgirl grew into a young woman who needed a trade of her own and found one. By the early 1890s, Grace Ingalls was approaching adulthood on the Northern Plains, and adulthood there meant something practical. A young woman in her position needed a way to support herself, a skill the world around her would actually pay for. Her obituary, published decades later in the Smet News, credits her training to Redfield College, sometimes called a normal school in Redfield in other period sources, a small naming inconsistency worth mentioning once and setting aside. The obituary records the training, though it leaves the dates unclear. It doesn't tell us exactly when she enrolled, how long her training lasted, or the terms under which she completed it, and no surviving transcript or diary entry fills that gap. What we have is a single, later, retrospective line that she went, that she trained there, and that teaching became her profession afterward. Normal schools and small regional colleges across the Dakota Plains existed specifically to prepare teachers quickly for the enormous number of new one-room schoolhouses springing up alongside the railroad towns. Training was often compressed and practical, aimed squarely at classroom readiness rather than an extended degree. A young woman might finish in a matter of months, not years, and move directly into a teaching position soon after, almost certainly close to the shape of Grace's own path. That kind of arrangement suited the region it served. A Prairie township needed a teacher long before it could support a four-year college graduate, and the normal school system that grew up around towns like Redfield existed to close exactly that gap, quickly and repeatedly, class after class. Grace passed through that same practical pipeline that trained a great many of her contemporaries, which is precisely why her own record here is thin. She wasn't unusual enough, in the eyes of the institutions keeping records at the time, to warrant more than a passing mention. Consider what this actually meant for someone in her particular position on the Northern Plains. She had grown up in a farming household, one that depended on every member's labour and later, every member's income. Teaching offered something genuinely rare for a young woman on the Northern Plains at this time, a wage of her own, earned outside her father's farm and independent of any husband she might eventually marry. It wasn't glamorous. Rural teachers were often paid modestly, moved between postings as districts needed them, and boarded with local families rather than living independently. But it was real, it was hers, and it grew from the teacher training her obituary records, training that opened a door most young women in her position never got the chance to walk through. It also placed her inside a genuinely common path for young women of her generation. Teaching was, by a wide margin, the most accessible professional route open to a young unmarried woman on the Dakota Plains at the turn of the century, since the rapid spread of small rural school districts created constant demand for new teachers, faster than any other local profession could absorb workers. Grace wasn't unusual in choosing this path. What makes her case worth our attention is that it's one of the very few places in her adult life where the record actually names what she did and roughly when she did it. Before this point, Grace existed mainly as a daughter, a younger sister, a schoolgirl inside someone else's household and someone else's story. After Redfield, she existed as something else, a trained working teacher capable of standing in front of a classroom and earning her own income, independent of her family's farm. No letter tells us whether she loved the work or simply chose the sensible option available to her. The fact that she trained for classroom work and then taught is significant enough on its own, without an invented motive to make it matter. That preparation offered a practical route into paid classroom work in a region that needed teachers. No certificate or graduation record was inspected for this project, so the exact credential remains unclear. What survives is the profession that followed, the named districts where Grace taught, the primary department in Smet, District 37, and District 58 in Esmond Township, and the public praise her work later received. It's a small, quiet turn in a life that has so far been described almost entirely through other people's chapters and other people's decisions. For the first time, Grace has a role the record can name on its own terms, separate from her family, separate from her sister's books, standing on the simple strength of her training and classroom work. It's also worth remembering what this training cost her, in the plainest sense. A young woman leaving home to train, even briefly, meant time away from the family farm, room and board to be arranged, and a period of her life spent somewhere the record simply doesn't follow her closely, with no surviving certificate or enrolment record to fill in the details. That absence of detail isn't a sign that nothing happened. It's a sign of exactly the kind of gap this whole account keeps running into. A real step forward, taken by a real person, preserved only in outline. That gap is worth naming plainly rather than smoothing over. We don't have Grace's own words about this stretch of her life, the way we have Laura's manuscript describing Burr Oak. What we have instead is an obituary, written years later to summarise a finished life, and that's simply a different kind of source, with a different kind of silence built into it. Training at Redfield was one thing. Being trusted with a classroom and praised for it in print was another. Once trained, Grace went to work. According to researcher compilations, she taught in several specific settings around the Smet area. The primary department in town itself, District 37, and District 58 in Esmond Township. These were named specific one-room schoolhouse postings, the same kind of institution that anchored small communities across the Dakota Plains, each serving a handful of families across the surrounding farmland, with terms that rotated by season and need. Picture what a posting like District 58 actually meant. A single room, a single teacher, often boarding with a nearby farm family for the length of the term. Students of wildly different ages sharing the same space, the same stove, the same handful of books, all depending on one young woman to manage every grade at once. Terms rotated with the agricultural calendar, since farm children were needed at home during planting and harvest, and a teacher like Grace might move from one district to another as positions opened, building a working reputation one small community at a time. Moving between postings this way was ordinary work for a young rural teacher, but it also meant something practical for how she was seen. Each new district was a fresh introduction, a fresh chance to be judged on her own merits by people who hadn't watched her grow up. By the time she reached the primary department in Smet itself, back among people who had known her family for years, she was arriving with a working record already behind her, not simply as Charles and Caroline's daughter. 3 different postings across at least 2 townships, spanning the primary grades in town and full one-room duty out in Esmond Township, suggest a teacher trusted with enough range to handle whatever assignment the county's school districts actually needed filled. That range, moving where the work was, taking on different grade levels and different communities, is itself a kind of evidence about her reputation, even without a single surviving performance record to back it up directly. It also means Grace was, by 1901, a familiar working presence across a fairly wide stretch of the county, not confined to a single schoolhouse or a single community's memory of her. That breadth matters when we consider how thoroughly her adult record still manages to thin out later on. The district details come from later researcher compilations, not a single institutional ledger independently inspected, though that doesn't make them unreliable. What isn't in doubt because it survives in her own community's own printed words is what people thought of her work. In October of 1901, the Smet News ran an announcement with a specific direct compliment. Grace was, in the paper's own words, one of the leading lady teachers in this county, who had met with splendid success wherever she has been employed. This isn't an exceptional claim on its own. Newspapers of this era offered this kind of warm compliment fairly often around weddings, more period courtesy than unique honour. But it's real, printed, and attached directly to Grace by name, in a paper her own neighbours read, describing her actual professional reputation. It tells us that whatever else history did or didn't preserve about Grace Ingalls, her neighbours considered her genuinely good at her job. It's a small thing. A single sentence in a small-town newspaper column, easy to skim past if you didn't know to look for it, but hold it against everything we've just walked through, the missing birth chapter, the compressed childhood, the training the record barely names, and that sentence becomes something more substantial. It's one of the very few moments in this whole account where Grace Ingalls appears in print, described plainly, purely on the strength of her own work, with no reference to her famous sister, her family name, or her upcoming marriage. For one autumn afternoon in 1901, Grace Ingalls was simply a respected teacher, known on her own terms. It doesn't tell us which students she taught or how she felt about the work, and newspaper compliments of this kind followed a fairly standard template across small-town papers. But it's a genuine piece of independent testimony about a life that otherwise survives mostly through family records and administrative documents, and it's worth letting it land before the story moves on. Set alongside everything before it, this is a real turn. A girl born into a chapter her own family's books skip, entirely has grown into a young woman her own community singles out by name, in print, for being good at her work. That's not a small thing to arrive at, even in a life the record otherwise tells us so little about. Whatever else this account has to say honestly, that single newspaper sentence is not one of the uncertain parts. It happened, it was printed, and it was about Grace, on her own terms. Hold on to that compliment for a moment before moving forward. It's the kind of small printed fact this account keeps returning to. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, but real, specific, and independent of anything her family name might have arranged for her. Grace earned that sentence on her own, in her own classroom, in front of her own students, long before anyone thought to write her obituary. It's also worth noticing what the announcement doesn't do. It doesn't mention Laura at all, and it doesn't need to. It identifies Grace as Charles and Caroline's daughter, and nothing more. For one printed paragraph, Grace Ingalls stood entirely on her own professional record, in a town that had watched her grow up and chose, at this particular moment, to describe her on those terms alone. That same autumn, her public identity changed again when she married. The announcement carrying that compliment about Grace's teaching was, in fact, a wedding announcement. On October the 16th, 1901, Grace Ingalls married Nathan William Dow. The marriage is documented. Genealogical records, museum biographical material, and researcher compilation all agree on the date and the name, which is exactly the kind of convergence that lets a fact stand on its own without much hedging. According to the same announcement, the ceremony took place in the Ingalls family parlour. That gives the marriage a specific and familiar setting, though the notice does not tell us who else stood in the room or what the scene looked like. The announcement also told readers the couple's plans. Grace and Nate will make their home on the farm for the present, referring to Nate's farm south of the town of Manchester, South Dakota. Within the space of one autumn day, Grace Ingalls, independent working teacher, publicly praised in print, became also Grace Dow, a married woman beginning a new household on a working farm. Marriage didn't erase the professional identity the same newspaper had just finished describing. The same short article that announced her wedding preserved, in the same breath, the record of her working life. Grace didn't disappear into an anonymous domestic role the moment she married. She carried two identities into this new chapter at once, printed side by side in the same short column, as though there were nothing unusual about a woman being both. There's something in that phrase, for the present, that suggests a household expecting change, one that understood its arrangement on the farm south of Manchester as a chapter rather than a permanent fixture. That phrase would prove more accurate than anyone writing it that October could have known. This household would in fact be reshaped more than once in the years ahead, by health, by family loss, by circumstances entirely outside Grace and Nate's control. We'll come back to that. Just weeks earlier, that same newspaper had described Grace purely through her own professional standing, a leading local teacher, praised on her own merits. Now the same event that carried that compliment into permanent print also marked the moment her public identity would begin to be shared with someone else's name. The newspaper reported both facts side by side, as though a woman's professional reputation and her marriage were simply two ordinary facts about the same ordinary, respected person. Nate Dow himself remains one of the quieter figures in this story. The record gives us his name, his approximate age, and the location of his farm, but not a portrait of the man himself, his personality, or how the two of them came to marry. What we can say is that he was an established farmer south of Manchester, with land and a working operation already in place, solid enough that a newspaper could confidently describe the couple's plan to make their home there. Whatever drew Grace and Nate together, the paperwork trail doesn't reach that far. A farm south of Manchester meant, in practice, a working operation of its own, distinct from the Ingalls homestead Grace had grown up on. It meant new neighbours, a new township, a new set of daily routines built around whatever crops and livestock the Dow farm carried. Grace was not simply joining a husband. She was joining an entire working household that existed before she arrived, and stepping into a role inside it that the record again describes only in outline. Manchester was its own township, distinct from Smet, which meant Grace's marriage carried her into a new community as well as a new household, with its own neighbours and its own name on its own mail. That's a modest fact, but a real one, and it's the clearest picture the surviving record lets us draw of where Grace actually lived for this stretch of her life. Notice the pattern building here. Grace's birth, documented but skipped in the family's own published account. Her childhood, real but thinly recorded. Her teaching, named, districts and all, but resting on a researcher compilation rather than a single confirmed ledger. And now her marriage, confirmed by multiple converging sources down to the exact date, yet almost entirely silent on anything beyond the bare facts of who, when, and where. Each stage of Grace's adult life arrives with its own particular shape of documentation, some firmer, some thinner, but none of it ever quite as full as the version her sister eventually wrote for the world. That pattern isn't a flaw in this account's research. It's the actual shape of Grace's surviving record, and naming it plainly, once, here, is more useful than pretending otherwise as we move further into her adult life. The wedding announcement itself said something else worth pausing on. Grace was 24 when she married. Nate Dow was around 42, based on the birth date most commonly recorded for him. A small hedge, since his exact birth date isn't as firmly confirmed as the marriage record itself. The age gap was real, and it wasn't unusual for this era. Marriages between younger women and older established men were common on the northern plains at the turn of the century, often tied to practical questions of land, income and household stability rather than scandal. We'll simply state the arithmetic and move on. The couple didn't have children. This too is a plain fact of household structure. No letter survives explaining a wish for children that went unmet. No diary records grief or disappointment, and no family account describes the couple's private feelings on the matter. Grace Ingalls. Dow deserves better than an invented emotional life built on a gap in the record, so we'll leave it exactly where the evidence leaves it. A household without children was, in this period and region, one shape a marriage could reasonably take, not automatically a household defined by absence. Grace and Nate's household still had its farm to run, its own daily rhythms, its own place within a wider family and community that included Grace's parents, her sisters, and the town she'd grown up in. A working farm required constant labour whether or not children were present, and Grace's later newspaper work suggests a household that remained active and outward-facing rather than one that simply closed inward. That's all the record actually gives us here, and it's enough. A marriage, a farm, no children, and a woman who kept working beyond her own front door. Nothing more needs to be added, and nothing more should be, to make that count as a real, complete fact about a real life. Married life didn't end Grace's public identity. It gave it a new form. Marriage and farm life didn't close the door on Grace's presence beyond her own household. According to a South Dakota Historical Society presentation and biographical material from the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame, Grace was known locally as a newspaper writer, contributing items to area papers over a sustained stretch of her adult life. Her obituary, published in 1941, makes the specific version of this claim explicit. Grace had a natural talent for writing and was correspondent for the News and the Huronite for years. Correspondent in a town the size of Smet rarely meant a job in the modern sense, with an office or a byline attached to a desk. It far more often meant a trusted literate community member the editor could rely on for small dispatches from a particular neighbourhood. Who had visitors that week? Whose barn went up? What the weather had done to the roads? It was real writing, published regularly, read by real neighbours, and it required real skill to do consistently over years, exactly the span her obituary claims. It simply wasn't the kind of writing that carried an individual's name attached to each entry, which is why locating a specific surviving column proves so difficult now. 2 named papers, the News and the Huronite, an acclaimed span of years rather than a single season. That's a more specific claim than most of what survives about Grace's adult life, even without a byline to point to directly. The obituary writer considered her writing life significant enough to name it alongside teaching and marriage. One of 3 things the notice chose to record about her. Set that against everything else this stretch of Grace's life has already shown us. A trained teacher publicly praised, a married farm partner documented plainly, and now a local writer associated in her obituary with 2 named papers across an unspecified but real span of years. None of these 3 roles cancels out the others. They sit side by side in the record, the way they must have sat side by side in her actual days. No single surviving newspaper column has been located and attributed to Grace Ingalls Dow by name. That's not unusual. Rural correspondents in this period typically wrote short, unsigned columns of local items absorbed into the paper's general local news section, rather than credited individually. Her community recognised her for the writing. It's simply proven difficult so far to isolate in the surviving record. There's something quietly fitting and a little frustrating in that. Grace grew up as the youngest sister of a woman who had become one of the most widely read writers in American history. And here, in her own adult life, sits a second, smaller writing identity entirely her own, real enough that institutional accounts and her own obituary both preserved it, yet invisible enough, in the specific sense of a byline, that we can't hand you a single sentence and say, with certainty, these words are hers. 2 sisters, 2 writing lives, documented at wildly different levels of detail, for reasons that have far more to do with how unsigned local journalism worked in this period than any difference in either woman's talent. Here is where Grace stands as this first stretch of her adult life comes into view. A young woman born into a stretch her own family's famous book skip over grew up, largely undocumented, in a real Dakota Territory town. She trained for a real profession, worked in named schools, and earned a specific printed compliment from her own community. She married a specific man on a specific day in a specific place and settled into a specific working farm. She became known, in her obituary, as a genuine local writer, even though the words she wrote haven't yet been recovered. 3 separate public identities, teacher, wife, and farm partner, local writer, layered onto one another rather than replacing one another, all before Grace turned 30. Set that against the opening of this account. A baby born in a stretch her sister's book Skip entirely has grown, by her late 20s, into a woman with teacher training, classroom work, a documented marriage and farm household, and an obituary recorded writing reputation, each preserved at a different level of certainty. That is not nothing. It is in fact a fuller adult life than the surviving record often gets credit for holding. Think back to where we started tonight. A rented brick house, a family the published books quietly step around, a baby girl with no chapter of her own. Everything since has been an attempt to answer, plainly and carefully, what actually happened next. The answer so far is a life built in stages, each one real, each one documented at its own honest level of certainty, and each one adding up to something considerably fuller than a single missing chapter would suggest. That's where we'll leave Grace for now. Married, working a farm, teaching behind her, and a local writing reputation quietly building alongside everything else. It's a full life by any ordinary measure. What happens to it next didn't come from within the household itself. It came from outside through her husband's health, and it's where the next stretch of this story has to begin. It would be easy to assume a life this steady simply continued on its course. It didn't. Households built this solidly could still be reorganized entirely by a single change in one person's health, and that's exactly what was about to happen here. For years, this household held steady. Then Nate's health began to change everything around it. By 1908, Nate Dow's health had begun to fail, some years after that plain, hopeful newspaper phrase about making their home on the farm for the present. No diagnosis survives to tell us exactly what was wrong with him, and this account isn't going to guess at one. What survives instead is a decision, and decisions are often the clearest window we get into a household's real condition. According to one researcher's account, Nate and Grace spent an extended stretch of that summer on the Oregon coast, travelling with friends named Fuller, after renting out their farm south of Manchester, the same farm the wedding announcement had once called their home for the present. That single choice tells us a great deal on its own. A working farm doesn't run itself, and handing it over to a tenant, even temporarily, meant the household's main source of income and daily structure was being set aside for the sake of Nate's health. This wasn't a short trip taken lightly. It was a real reorganization of the life Grace and Nate had built together over the better part of a decade. Someone had to be found to take over the farm's daily operations, livestock had to be arranged for, and crops already in the ground had to be entrusted to another person's judgment. None of that happens on a whim. It happens because staying home was, for whatever reason, no longer the better option, and getting Nate somewhere else mattered more than keeping the operation running under the family's own hand that season. When they came back from the coast, according to this same account, Grace and Nate didn't return directly to their own farm. They moved in instead with Grace's mother, Caroline, and her sister, Mary, back in Smet. Two households that had been running as separate independent units for years folded back together, at least for a while. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the first time since Grace's wedding that her life and her birth family's life come back into direct daily contact in the surviving record. Marriage and farm life had given Grace two homes to be responsible for. Nate's health now meant those two homes, briefly, became one again. We don't know how long this arrangement lasted, or exactly what daily life looked like inside it. What we can say is that it marks the first real crack in the stable, three-part identity Grace had spent most of a decade building. Teacher, then wife and farm partner, then local correspondent. All three of those roles had assumed a working farm as their anchor. Now the anchor was, at least temporarily, gone, rented out to someone else, while Grace and her husband lived under her mother's roof instead of their own. There's a particular kind of strain in that, worth naming plainly even without any letter to confirm how Grace herself experienced it. A household built through years of separate layered identities, teacher, wife, writer, suddenly found itself organised around one uncertain variable nobody in the family had the power to fix or predict. It's tempting, looking back from a comfortable distance, to read a trip to the Oregon coast as a pleasant getaway rather than a hardship. For a household built around a working farm's income, though, choosing to travel instead of working the land themselves that season was almost certainly a response to necessity rather than leisure. Nate needed something, whether rest, a change of climate, or simply distance from the demands of daily farm labour, and Grace went with him, which meant setting her own established routines aside as well. Whatever teaching she might still have been doing on the side, whatever writing she was contributing to the local papers, all of it had to bend around a husband whose health could no longer be counted on to hold steady. It's worth remembering, too, what this moment meant for Grace's own sense of place in the world. Since her wedding, she'd been, first and foremost, the mistress of her own household, a woman with a farm, a husband, and a working identity entirely separate from her parents' home. Moving back in with her mother and sister, even briefly, even for good practical reasons, meant stepping back, at least temporarily, into a household she'd once left behind as a bride. It's not a step backward in any failure sense. It's simply a reminder that even a well-established adult life can be reorganized by circumstances nobody chose. This is also the first moment in Grace's adult story where her household and her mother's household appear together in the same surviving account, rather than as two separate threads we've had to follow one at a time. Everything up to this point, teaching, marriage, the farm, the writing, had kept Grace's own household distinct from the one she'd grown up in. Nate's health, whatever exactly caused it, was the first thing strong enough to fold those two threads back together, even briefly. None of it appears anywhere in the family's own published books, of course. Whatever hardship this stretch actually held for Grace and Nate, it happened entirely outside the story the world would eventually come to know. That's simply the nature of this account. The closer we get to Grace's real adult difficulties, the further we move from anything Laura's readers were ever shown, and the more this whole story starts to feel like the genuine other half of the family the books only ever told from one angle. Renting out a farm before an extended absence was a fairly common arrangement in this period, when a family needed to travel but couldn't simply leave land and livestock untended. A tenant would work the ground and keep up the buildings in exchange for a share of the crop or a fixed rent, and the owning family would return, sometimes months later, to a farm that had kept going without them. It solved a practical problem. It also meant Grace and Nate's own household, the one built so plainly in that 1901 wedding announcement, was no longer the fixed centre of their daily lives, at least for this stretch. That's one account. A separate institutional source tells a related but not identical story. The National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame's own biographical material describes something broader. With Nathan Dow's health failing, the couple rented out their farm and toured the Pacific coast. It doesn't mention Oregon specifically, or the Fullers, or a single summer in 1908. It describes a pattern, a general habit of renting the farm and travelling whenever Nate's health required it. That leaves us with a real, honest question. Are these two accounts describing the very same trip, just from two different angles and with two different levels of detail? Or is the institutional biography describing something broader, a pattern that repeated more than once over the years, of which the 1908 Oregon visit was simply one instance? The honest answer is that we don't know, and this account isn't going to pretend otherwise by picking whichever version sounds cleaner. The specific researcher account traces back to particular family recollections and correspondence. The kind of detail that survives when someone remembers a specific summer, a specific set of travelling companions, a specific coastline. The institutional biography, by contrast, reads more like a summary drawn from a broader look at the couple's life, the kind of general pattern a biographer notices after reviewing several mentions across different years, rather than pinning down one particular season. Both kinds of sources are legitimate. They simply operate at different levels of detail, and that difference alone can produce exactly the kind of overlap without perfect alignment that we're looking at here. Family history built from scattered sources often looks exactly like this. Two honestly researched accounts that agree on the shape of things and disagree on the specifics. Neither disputes that Nate's health was declining. Neither disputes that the farm was set aside at least once in response. Neither disputes that Grace's own life bent around her husband's needs during this stretch. That agreement matters more than the disagreement in the end. Two independently researched sources, built from entirely different kinds of material, arrive at the same core picture of a marriage reorganized by illness. That kind of convergence, even without perfect alignment on the details, is worth more than a single, tidier-sounding account would be on its own. This kind of gap between sources isn't unique to Grace's story, and it's worth saying so plainly, rather than treating it as some special weakness in her particular record. Almost any family history reconstructed generations later, from letters, newspaper mentions, and second-hand museum summaries rather than a single continuous diary, will contain stretches like this one. What makes it feel more noticeable here is simply that we're paying closer attention to Grace's life than most accounts ever have, which means we're running into the honest limits of what survives sooner and more often than a more casual retelling would. It's the kind of thing that happens naturally when a life like Grace's gets pieced together from whatever survives, rather than from a single, continuous, authorized account written by the person herself. A biographer working from family memory catches one version. A researcher working from correspondence and newspaper fragments catches another. Both are honest attempts to describe the same real household, seen from two different vantage points, decades after the fact. Neither of these sources had any reason to invent a difficulty that wasn't there. A museum writing an institutional biography and an independent researcher compiling family history both arrived separately at the same basic conclusion. Nate's health was a real, recurring problem that shaped this household's decisions more than once. When two independent efforts land on the same underlying truth without coordinating, that's about as solid as this kind of secondary evidence gets. It's worth remembering too that both of these accounts, however incomplete, agree on the underlying shape of Grace's life at this point far more than they disagree. It might be tempting to simply merge the two accounts into one tidy narrative, treating the Oregon trip as definitively the same event the museum describes in general terms. We're not going to do that here, because doing so would mean claiming a certainty neither source actually provides on its own. It might equally be tempting to treat them as entirely separate, unrelated events, but that risks understating just how disruptive Nate's declining health actually was to this household, if in fact it forced more than one such retreat over the years. The honest middle ground is simply to hold both accounts as real, as pointing toward the same underlying truth, and as not fully reconciled in their specifics. So here is what we can honestly say, holding both accounts apart rather than merging them. Nate's health declined, seriously enough to force real change in how the household operated. At least once, and quite possibly more than once. That meant renting out the farm and travelling to the Pacific coast, and at least once coming home to her mother's roof instead of her own. Whether that was one episode or a repeated pattern, the underlying fact holds either way. Nate's health had become the organising force in this household's decisions in a way nothing else had been before. Whatever the exact sequence, one fact is not in dispute. Within a generation, the household Grace was born into would be gone. Charles Ingalls died on June the 8th, 1902, not long after Grace's own wedding. Grace had been a married woman for less than a year when she lost her father. The record here is plain, and doesn't need much said about it beyond the fact itself. It's simply true, and it's the first thread of the household Grace grew up in coming loose. Think about the timing for a moment. Grace had married in October of 1901, moved to a new farm, begun a new household with Nate. Less than 8 months later, the father who'd carried the family through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and finally Dakota Territory, the man whose decisions had shaped every move of Grace's early life, was gone. She'd barely settled into her own household before the household she'd grown up in lost its head. The larger loss came more than 2 decades later. Caroline Ingalls, Grace's mother, died in April of 1924. By then, Grace was in her late 40s, long past the young teacher and new bride we met earlier in this story. With Caroline's death, the household that had produced Grace sheltered her, and in 1908 briefly taken her and Nate back in, was gone for good. No parent remained. Whatever Grace had once been able to return to, in the most literal sense, no longer existed. 22 years separate these two deaths, and in that stretch Grace had built and rebuilt an entire adult life of her own. A marriage, a farm, a writing identity, a household reorganized more than once around her husband's health. Caroline had remained a fixed point through all of it, the parent still living, the household still theoretically there to return to if needed, even after Charles was gone. Her death in 1924 removed that fixed point permanently. We're not going to invent what that felt like. No letter, no diary entry, no family account tells us Grace's private response to either death. And this account isn't in the business of supplying feelings the record doesn't give us. What we can say, plainly, is what changed. A household that had stood behind Grace her entire life, first as a child, then as a grown woman with a family of her own to return to, simply ended. That's not a small structural fact, even stated without embellishment. It's the kind of loss that reorders a family's whole shape going forward, whatever the private experience of it may have been. There's a particular weight to being the generation left standing after both parents are gone, even when a person already has their own household, their own marriage, their own decades of adult life behind them. Grace was no longer anyone's daughter in the ordinary living sense of that word. She was, from this point forward, one of the family's own elders, whether she felt ready for that shift or not, and whatever came next for her would have to be built without the household she'd started from. It's worth noticing, too, what these two deaths did and didn't do to Grace's own documented life. Charles's death in 1902 doesn't appear to have altered her marriage or her new farm household in any way the record preserves. Caroline's death, more than 2 decades later, is different. It sits right at the hinge point of this account, the moment after which a new, real responsibility enters Grace's story, one this account will turn to next. There's a kind of quiet symmetry worth noticing between these two losses and the household disruptions we've just walked through. Nate's health had already, at least once, sent Grace and her husband temporarily back under her mother's roof. Now that same maternal household, the one that had absorbed them in 1908, was permanently gone. Whatever safety net Grace's birth family had once represented, even in its diminished later form, had finally run out. Grace was in her mid-40s by the time Caroline died, an established adult with her own decades of marriage and work behind her. That's worth stating plainly, because it changes what this loss actually meant. This wasn't a young woman losing a parent early in adulthood. It was a woman who'd already built and rebuilt an entire life of her own, losing the last living tie to the household she'd started from, at a point when she was, by any ordinary measure, already fully grown into whoever she was going to be. It's a different kind of loss than losing a parent at 20, and this account isn't going to treat it as anything less real for happening later. Grace had 2.5 decades of adult life fully lived, teaching, marriage, a farm reorganized more than once, before this particular thread finally came undone. That's not a small life interrupted early. It's a full life absorbing one more real change on top of everything that had already come before it. What came next for Grace was not dramatic. It was practical, and it changed her documented life all the same. An independent institutional biography from the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame states plainly that after her mother's death, Grace took on the care of her sister Mary, who'd been blind since childhood. This wasn't automatic or without complication, and this account isn't going to pretend it was. What actually happened next, in terms of where Mary lived and for how long, is genuinely unclear, and 2 separate sources disagree on the details in a way that hasn't been fully resolved. The museum's account suggests this care began in Manchester, close to Grace and Nate's own household, shortly after Caroline's death. A separate lower confidence account suggests Mary lived with Grace in Manchester for a stretch, before later moving on to live with their sister Carrie instead. Both agree that Grace was involved in Mary's care at some point in this period. They simply don't agree on exactly when that started, how long it lasted, or precisely how the responsibility was eventually passed along. We're going to hold that honestly rather than picking whichever version reads more smoothly. What mattered, in an era without formal institutions for this kind of need, was simply which relatives were available and willing. Carolyn died in April of 1924, and it was in the months and years after that date that this new responsibility took shape. Caring for a blind adult sister in this period meant exactly that. A family member taking on the role because there was rarely another option. There were no dedicated care facilities within easy reach for a family of this size and means. No professional support beyond whatever a doctor might occasionally provide. Care for an adult family member who needed it fell, as a matter of course, to whichever relative had the room, the proximity, and the willingness to take it on. Grace, already established, already married, already carrying a teaching background and a working farm behind her, became one of the relatives this responsibility could reasonably fall to. This doesn't mean Grace silently sacrificed anything, and it doesn't mean she single-handedly held the family together. Those are the kinds of phrases that turn a real, documented family responsibility into an invented emotional legend, and we're not going to do that here. What we can say is this. A new responsibility entered Grace's life at a point when she already had a marriage, a farm, and a writing life to manage. It didn't replace those other roles. It layered onto them, the same way marriage had layered onto teaching, and the way local writing had layered onto marriage. Grace's adult life kept accumulating real, documented responsibilities, one after another, without ever fully shedding the ones that came before. Notice, too, what this responsibility doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us whether Grace resented the added burden, embraced it warmly, or simply absorbed it the way people absorb the practical demands life places on them. It doesn't tell us what conversations passed between the sisters, or how Mary herself felt about needing this kind of arrangement at all. What it does tell us is a simple structural fact. By the mid-1920s, Grace's household included, at least for some stretch of time, a sister who needed care that only a family member could reasonably provide, and Grace was one of the family members who provided it. It's also worth setting this responsibility against everything Grace was already carrying by this point in her life. She was married, had spent years managing a farm household reorganized more than once by her husband's health, and had built a local reputation as a correspondent that stretched back over a decade. Adding Mary's care to that picture doesn't erase any of it. It simply means Grace's documented adult life, by her late 40s, had grown to include 4 distinct real responsibilities at once: wife, farm partner, writer, and now caregiver to a sister who needed one. There's a pattern worth naming here, one that's held steady across this account so far. Every time Grace's life gains a new role, marriage, correspondent work, now caregiving, it arrives on top of what came before rather than replacing it outright. That's a genuinely demanding way to live an adult life, layering responsibility onto responsibility across decades, and it's worth crediting Grace with exactly that, without needing to dress it up in language of sacrifice or martyrdom that the record simply doesn't support. It's worth remembering, finally, that this was one adult sister caring for another, not a young woman managing an infant or a stranger. Grace and Mary had grown up in the same household, under the same parents, through the same moves and the same hard years in Burr Oak and Smet. Whatever this caregiving actually looked like day to day, week to week, it took place between 2 people who already knew each other completely, which is its own kind of context, even without a single letter to describe it further. That shared history matters more than it might first seem. Whatever the exact residence chronology turns out to have been, and whatever else remains genuinely unresolved about these years, the underlying relationship wasn't a new one being formed under difficult circumstances. It was one of the oldest relationships in Grace's life, between 2 sisters who'd shared a childhood together in Burr Oak and Smet, simply taking on a new shape as their circumstances required. That's the honest shape of this responsibility, real, documented in outline by an institutional source independent of the Ingalls family's own papers, layered onto an already full life, and grounded in a relationship decades older than the responsibility itself. It was around this same period, historians now believe, that Laura turned to Grace for something only Grace could give her. By the 1930s, Laura Ingalls Wilder was deep into writing the books that would eventually make her family famous around the world, the same series that would later skip right over Grace's own birth. And in the middle of that work, Laura ran into a problem she couldn't solve on her own. She was trying to describe the Dakota Prairie of her childhood, the wildflowers that had covered it in the years the family first arrived, and she found she simply couldn't remember them clearly enough to write them the way she wanted to. Think about what that moment actually required of Laura. She was writing books meant to feel true to a real, remembered place, not a vague, generic prairie backdrop. Readers would eventually picture that landscape through her exact words, and she wanted those words to be accurate to what had actually grown there, not simply pleasant-sounding invention. But decades had passed since she had walked that ground as a child, and memory, even a writer's carefully trained memory, doesn't hold on to every small, specific detail forever. The particular flowers, their names, their colours, the order they appeared in each spring, had simply faded for her. So she did something the record actually preserves for us, in a way so much of Grace's own life isn't preserved. She wrote to Grace and asked, "This survives only through a second-hand transcription rather than the original letter, its exact location unconfirmed, so we'll hold that lightly." But the substance is clear enough. Laura, the sister whose books had quietly stepped around Grace's own earliest years, was now the one reaching out, asking her younger sister to supply something she herself no longer had. It's worth sitting with the shape of that for a moment, because it's the first time in this entire story that the direction of need runs the other way. Up to this point, Grace has mostly existed in relation to Laura's authorship, present in the books because Laura chose to put her there, absent from the record wherever Laura's account simply didn't follow her. Here, for once, Laura is the one who needs something Grace has, and she doesn't. It didn't make Grace a co-author, and it didn't make this a sustained writing partnership. It was a specific request, about a specific gap in Laura's own memory, and Grace was the person she trusted to fill it. Grace had grown up on that same Dakota prairie, had lived on farms surrounding Smet for most of her adult life, and had spent far more of her years actually walking that particular ground than Laura ever had. Once Laura's own path took her east, and eventually into writing. If anyone in the family still carried those specific details clearly, it made sense that it would be Grace. There's something worth pausing on here, in how this request must have arrived. By the 1930s, Grace's own adult life had already moved through teaching, marriage, a reorganized farm household, and the beginnings of care for Mary. A letter from Laura, asking about wildflowers from a childhood decades gone, would have reached a woman whose own daily concerns were entirely present. Tents, a husband's health, a sister's needs, a farm that had already been rented out once and might need to be again. And yet, somewhere amid all of that, Grace apparently took the time to sit down and answer, in detail, a question about flowers she hadn't needed to think about in years. It's also worth remembering what this letter represents in the larger shape of the two sisters' relationship. For most of this account so far, Grace has existed in relation to Laura only through absence, a birth the book skip, a childhood barely documented, an adult life recorded far more thinly than her sister's. This letter is the first documented moment where the relationship runs in the other direction entirely, where Laura is the one who needs, and Grace is the one who provides. We don't know how Grace felt receiving that request, whether it flattered her, whether it felt like an ordinary favour between sisters, or something else entirely. No source tells us that, and we're not going to invent it here. What we can say is simply that the letter arrived, and that Grace, amid a life already full with a husband's health, a sister's needs, and a farm whose future was still uncertain, took it seriously enough to answer with real specificity, which is exactly where this account turns to next. There's a small irony worth sitting with before we get to that answer. The sister whose own earliest chapter never made it into Laura's books turns out to be the one Laura wrote to when her own memory of an even earlier stretch of childhood needed filling in. The book skipped over Grace's beginning. They may well have needed Grace's memory to properly render their own. Writers of this era relied on exactly this kind of family memory fairly often, especially when writing about childhood decades after the fact. Laura's own recollection of the particular flowers that had coloured a particular season had simply faded the way memory does. Grace, who'd spent so much more of her adult life in and around that same landscape, apparently hadn't lost the same details. It's a small, human moment, tucked inside the process of writing a book that would eventually become beloved by millions of readers who'd never know this exchange had happened at all. Grace's answer, when it came, was specific. She didn't send back a vague impression or a general sense of prairie colour. She named the flowers, one after another, the way only someone who'd actually walked that ground repeatedly year after year could. The crocus came first, she wrote, early in the spring, before almost anything else dared show itself. Then came the wild onion blossom, in such numbers that the prairie itself would turn nearly white with them for a stretch each spring. Violets followed. So did sheep sorrel and buttercups, and the delicate windflower, sometimes called the anemone. She remembered wild peas threading through the grass, wild parsley, wild clover, and the bright, unmistakable orange of tiger lilies further into the season. And she noted, almost as an aside, that the sunflowers, the goldenrod, and the dandelions that most people now picture when they think of a prairie summer hadn't actually been part of that earlier landscape at all. Those came later. That's a remarkably specific answer to give from memory, decades removed from the actual prairie itself. It tells us something concrete about Grace that almost nothing else in this account manages to. She'd paid close attention to the world immediately around her, closely enough to reconstruct it flower by flower when her sister needed it most. Picture what that kind of memory actually requires. Not simply recalling that flowers existed, but holding on to their order across a season, their colour, their abundance, which ones crowded the prairie in great numbers, and which ones appeared only here and there. That's the kind of detail a person keeps only if they were paying real attention at the time, and kept paying attention to it, quietly, for years afterward. It's worth noticing, too, what this list actually reveals about Grace's own relationship to the landscape she'd grown up in. These aren't showy, dramatic details. A crocus pushing up before the last frost is properly cleared, a prairie briefly white with wild onion blossoms. Small, quiet, seasonal observations, the kind a person only accumulates by actually living somewhere for years, watching the same ground change with the same rhythm, spring after spring. Grace hadn't simply remembered that flowers existed on the prairie. She'd remembered the prairie itself in the kind of ordinary, unglamorous detail that only comes from having actually lived inside a place, rather than simply having passed through it. Compare that for a moment to Laura's own position at the time she asked. Laura had built an entire literary career on evoking exactly this kind of prairie landscape for readers who would never see it themselves. And for this particular detail, the specific flowers of a specific childhood, her own memory had failed her, while her younger sisters had held steady. It's a small, quiet reversal, easy to miss, but worth noticing plainly. The sister the books introduced without a chapter of her own turned out to be the one still holding the details the books needed most. None of this changes the earlier facts of this account. Grace's birth still isn't in the published books. Her childhood is still thinly documented. But this letter sits alongside those earlier facts now, not cancelling them out, simply complicating any version of this story that would paint Grace as nothing more than an absence in her sister's telling. She was absent from the page. She was not absent from the process. Hold that distinction carefully, because it's the closest this account can come, honestly, to answering its own central question so far. Grace wasn't written out of her sister's life. She was written out of her sister's books while remaining, in at least this one documented instance, genuinely present in the actual work of making them. That's a narrower, more precise claim than saying Grace was simply forgotten, and it's the truer one. We should be careful here about exactly what this proves and what it doesn't. No source confirms that Grace's specific words appear in the published books themselves. What we can say is only that Laura asked. Grace answered in detail, and that answer may well have informed the writing that followed, even if we can't point to a single published sentence and say, with certainty, this came from Grace's letter. It would be easy to overstate this exchange, to claim Grace secretly co-wrote some passage of a beloved children's book. That's not what the evidence supports, and stretching it that far would do Grace's real, more modest, more human contribution a disservice. It's also worth being honest about what this exchange was and wasn't. It wasn't a sustained collaboration between the sisters, stretching across years of shared writing work. It was, as far as the surviving record shows us, a single documented request and a single documented answer, and even a single exchange like this one tells us something the rest of Grace's record rarely manages to. Her own memory, her own attention, her own specific knowledge of the place she'd grown up in, was something her famous sister genuinely needed and genuinely turned to. Think back to where this account started. With a birth the published book simply skip over, a sister introduced mid-story with no chapter of her own. Set that against this letter. The same sister whose earliest years never made it into Laura's books turns out to be the one holding details Laura's books actually needed in order to exist in the form we know them. It doesn't erase the earlier omission. It doesn't rebalance the scales entirely. But it does complicate any simple story about Grace being merely left out. The farm that had carried so much of Grace's married life, meanwhile, was quietly coming to an end. According to Grace's own obituary, Nate's declining health eventually forced the couple to give up their farm entirely, not just rent it out for a season, but step away from active farm life for good. The same obituary tells us that afterward, they lived for some years in Smet, and for some years in Manchester, though it doesn't tell us clearly which came first, or exactly when the shift away from the farm actually happened. We're going to leave that order unresolved rather than guessing at it, the same way we left the Oregon and Pacific Coast accounts unresolved earlier in this story. What matters isn't the precise sequence of towns. What matters is the underlying shape of it. The working farm south of Manchester, the one that had anchored Grace's identity as a married woman since 1901, was no longer the centre of her life. Health, once again, had reorganised the household, just as it had back in 1908. Only this time the change appears to have been permanent rather than a single extended trip. Think about everything that farm had carried across those decades. It was where Grace and Nate began their marriage. It was the place the newspaper meant when it said they'd make their home there, for the present. It had been rented out once already and handed back. It had absorbed Grace's mother and sister for a stretch when the household needed to fold together, and now, finally, it was simply ending as an active part of Grace's daily life, quietly, without any dramatic final scene attached to it in the surviving record. There's something fitting, in a quiet way, about how little ceremony this ending receives in the record, especially set against how much ceremony the wedding announcement gave it back at the very beginning. So much of Grace's adult life has come to us in exactly this shape. Real, substantial changes, a marriage, a new responsibility, a farm's end, recorded only in outline, a sentence or two in an obituary written years after the fact. The farm doesn't get a send-off. It simply stops being where Grace lived, and the story moves on to wherever she and Nate settled next. Whatever the exact order of towns, this much is clear. By the time this stretch of Grace's life closes, the working farm that had defined her married identity for so long was behind her, and what remained ahead was a quieter, town-based chapter, still undocumented in most of its particulars, but real and still hers. Look back for a moment at everything this stretch of Grace's story has actually covered. A husband's health forcing a household to reorganise, not once but at least twice. 2 accounts of that reorganisation, honestly held apart rather than forced together. Her father's death, and then her mother's, closing the household she'd been born into. A new responsibility toward her sister Mary, layered onto everything she already carried. And in the middle of all of it, a single letter, asking for memories only she still held, and an answer that filled that request completely. That's not a thin stretch of history. It's a genuinely full one, even where the record leaves gaps we haven't tried to fill. Whatever came next for Grace, it would have to be built on top of all of that. A household without her parents, a farm without its old permanence, a sister needing care, and a letter already sent and answered. The active working centre of her adult life was shifting quietly toward its final shape, the same way it had shifted before, through marriage, through health scares, through loss, each time settling into something a little different from what came before it. It's a quiet ending for a place that mattered so much earlier in this account. There's no dramatic final scene, no last harvest described in anyone's own words, just a plain, later statement that the farm years had ended and town life had taken their place. That's often how real transitions actually happen, without ceremony, recorded only in outline long after the fact. A life spent partly on a working farm becomes eventually a life spent in town, and the record simply notes the change happened without preserving the moment itself. By the time the farm was gone, Grace's life was entering its final years. Her own obituary tells us plainly what those years look like, in language that doesn't need much embellishment to land. Until her health prevented it, the obituary says, Mrs. Dow was active in social activities, right up until an illness of several weeks arrived, following several years of ill health that had already been wearing on her before that final decline set in. We're not going to guess at what that illness actually was. No source names a specific cause, and this account isn't in the business of filling that kind of gap with invented detail. What the obituary gives us instead is a shape, rather than a diagnosis. A woman who stayed active, stayed socially present, stayed engaged in her community for years, even as her health quietly worsened underneath all of it, until a final stretch of weeks brought that active life to a close. There's something worth noticing in how the obituary phrases this. It doesn't describe a sudden collapse. It describes a slow wearing down, several years of declining health, followed by one final illness that finally ended her ability to stay active. That's the shape so many lives actually take at their end. Not a single dramatic turn, but a long gradual dimming, followed by a last stretch that closes things out. Think back for a moment to everything this account has already shown you about Grace's adult life. A teacher praised in print. A wife, publicly documented down to the parlour she married in. A farm partner whose household was rearranged more than once by her husband's health. A local correspondent, writing unsigned columns for years. A caregiver to her sister Mary, in a responsibility the record only partly traces. And threaded through all of it, a woman capable enough, attentive enough, to answer her famous sister's request for a childhood's worth of remembered wildflowers, name by name. All of that activity, all of that layered adult life continued according to her own obituary, right up until her health simply wouldn't allow it anymore. She wasn't a woman fading quietly into the background for decades before her death. She was active, present, and engaged, socially and by every account still working in whatever ways her circumstances allowed, until a genuinely final decline arrived and closed that chapter. It's worth sitting briefly with what social activities likely meant for a woman in Grace's position in a small Dakota town in the 1930s. Church gatherings, community events, visits with neighbours and family. The ordinary texture of small-town life that rarely gets individually documented but forms the actual substance of most people's days. Grace's obituary doesn't list specifics. It simply tells us she was part of that texture, actively, until she couldn't be anymore. Consider too how much this final active stretch tells us about the woman we've been following all evening. Somebody quietly fading from public life for years beforehand would have left behind a thinner, more withdrawn record. Grace's obituary instead describes continued engagement, right up until illness itself made continuing impossible. That's consistent with everything else we've seen. A woman who kept adding roles to her life rather than shedding them. who kept showing up in whatever form her circumstances allowed for as long as her body would let her. By the time that final illness of several weeks arrived, Grace was in her mid-60s, having spent more than 4 decades as a documented adult in her own right, first as a teacher, then as a wife and farm partner, then as a correspondent, a caregiver, and finally, for one letter at least, a trusted keeper of family memory. Whatever those final weeks actually held, we don't have the details, and we're not going to invent them. What we do have is the plain, dignified fact of an ending, arriving after a genuinely full life. It's worth pausing one final time on just how much ground that life actually covered. From a birth, the published books skip entirely, through a childhood barely documented, into teaching, marriage, farm partnership, local writing, family caregiving, and a documented act of remembering that her own famous sister genuinely needed. That's the shape of the adult life this final illness eventually closed. None of it happened in front of an audience, the way her sister's life eventually would. It happened in classrooms, in a farmhouse south of Manchester, in unsigned newspaper columns, in a sister's household needing care, and in one careful letter about wildflowers. Quiet work, mostly, done by a woman whose name most readers of her family's famous books wouldn't recognise even now, and yet work substantial enough to fill an entire adult lifetime, start to finish. That's worth holding on to as this account moves toward its close. A quiet life isn't the same thing as an empty one. Grace's obituary describes decades of steady, documented activity, right up until the very end, and that steadiness is itself a kind of answer to anyone who might assume a thin historical record means a thin actual life. There's a stillness in a life closing this way, active and engaged right up until it simply couldn't be anymore, that feels worth honouring plainly, without needing to dramatise it into something it wasn't. Grace Ingalls Dow met the end of her active life the way she'd met most of what came before it, steadily, without complaint recorded anywhere, and without any dramatic final gesture the record thought worth preserving. We're going to leave Grace's last active years exactly there, at that steady, dignified close, and let the account turn now to what happened after, because what happened after is, in its own way, just as much a part of Grace's story as anything that came before it. On November the 10th, 1941, Grace died in Manchester. The date itself is confirmed, plainly, without dispute. She was buried at Smet Cemetery, the same town that had shaped so much of her life, from schoolgirl to teacher, to the sister a famous newspaper compliment had once singled out by name. There's a small, human wrinkle worth mentioning here. Her grave marker and her recorded death date don't line up perfectly, a minor discrepancy that shows up now and then in records from this era, when a stone was carved sometime after the fact by someone working from memory or second-hand information, rather than an official certificate in hand. It doesn't change anything about what actually happened. It's simply the kind of small imperfection that survives in a life documented this unevenly. Nate outlived her by nearly 3 years, dying in May of 1944. Whatever this marriage had been, built on a farm south of Manchester, reorganized more than once by his own declining health, tested by a decade of tenant arrangements and shared households, it ended in the end the way most long marriages do, with one partner going first and the other left to carry on a little while longer without them. Think about the arc of that marriage for a moment, from beginning to end. It started with a newspaper announcement praising Grace's teaching in the same breath as her wedding, back in 1901. It carried the two of them through a farm, through at least one extended trip forced by Nate's health, through a stretch living under Grace's mother's roof, through the eventual end of the farm itself, and finally through Grace's own death, with Nate surviving her by not quite 3 years. 40 years of marriage, give or take, most of it undocumented in its daily texture, all of it real. Here's where this account has to be especially careful, because it's exactly the kind of moment where a documentary is tempted to reach for an irony that isn't actually there. Grace died in the same general period that Little Town on the Prairie, one of the books in her sister's famous series, was published. It would be easy, dramatically tempting even, to draw a straight line between those two facts, to suggest some meaningful timing between Grace's death and the publication of a book about the very childhood she'd helped Laura remember. We're not going to do that. The exact chronology, whether Grace's death came before or after the book actually reached readers that year, isn't clearly established in the record available to us, and building a precise irony on an unclear timeline would be inventing meaning the evidence doesn't support. What we can say, honestly, is only this. In the same broad stretch of 1941, Grace Ingalls Dow's life ended, and one more installment of the story that had made her family famous reached the public. Whether those two events happened weeks apart or months apart in either order isn't something this account is going to claim to know. What matters is the plainer fact underneath it. The sister whose birth those books skipped over was, by the time this particular volume appeared, no longer alive to read it, or to be read into it any further than she already had been. It's worth resisting, too, any temptation to read some larger sisterly symbolism into that coincidence of timing, however tempting it might feel after everything this evening has covered. Books get written on their own schedules, shaped by publishers, deadlines, and a writer's own working pace, none of which had anything to do with Grace's health in her final year. The two threads, a sister's death and a series steadily continuing, simply happened to occupy the same calendar year, the way countless unrelated events happen to share a year without meaning anything about each other at all. What we can say, plainly, is that Grace's death closes the active portion of her documented life. Everything from this point in our story forward concerns what she left behind rather than what she was still doing, still building, still becoming. That's a real shift in the kind of story this account has to tell, and it's worth marking clearly before we make that turn. It's a shift worth naming, honestly, because it changes what kind of evidence we're able to draw on for the rest of this account. Up to this point, we've been tracing a living woman's choices, her marriage, her work, her responsibilities. From here forward, we're tracing what survived her, the physical and archival traces left behind once the life itself had ended. That's a different kind of story, quieter in its own way, but it's the story this evening still has left to tell. It's the kind of turn every biography eventually has to make, whether the subject is famous or not. A living person makes choices, a dead person leaves records, and it falls to whoever comes looking, decades or a century later, to decide what those records add up to. Grace's records, as we're about to see, are scattered across more places than you might expect, and it's worth walking through exactly where before this account tries to say what all of it means together. For now, simply hold this much in mind. A full adult life, 40 years of marriage, layered roles, a documented act of remembering that mattered to her own famous sister, closed out quietly in Manchester in the fall of 1941. What comes next is the record of what that life left behind, and it turns out to be more than you might expect from a life documented this unevenly. The wedding announcement that once called Grace one of the leading lady teachers in the county, the obituary that later called her a natural writer, the museum biography that traced her marriage and her caregiving, none of these were compiled by Grace herself, and none of them were written with the thought that someone, generations later, would try to stitch them together into a single evening's telling. That's worth remembering as this account turns toward its final movement. Every fact we've gathered came from someone else's record-keeping, done for someone else's reasons, at some other point entirely. It's a quiet way for an active adult life to end, folded into the same calendar year as a piece of her family's growing literary fame, without any confirmed connection between the two beyond simple coincidence of timing. That's not a small ending. It's simply an ending the record won't let us dramatise beyond what actually happened. What Grace left behind did not disappear. It scattered. That word matters, and it's worth being precise about what it actually means here. Scattered doesn't mean lost in the sense of destroyed or gone forever. It means spread out, in pieces, across different institutions and collections that nobody has yet gathered fully into one place, and one of those pieces sits, right now, in a folder in Brookings, South Dakota. Grace Ingalls Dow kept a diary. That diary survives today, catalogued at South Dakota State University's archives and special collections as part of the John E. Miller papers held under a specific locator, Box 70, Folder 10. It's open for research. Anyone with the proper access could, in principle, walk into that reading room and ask to see it. Nobody involved in making this particular account has done that yet. Its pages have not been read for this telling, and so we're not going to tell you what's inside them, because we genuinely don't know. Think about what that actually means for how history like Grace's gets written. A diary existing and a diary being read are two entirely different things. Somebody has to travel to that reading room, request that specific box and folder, and sit with those actual pages before anything inside them becomes part of the historical record the rest of us can draw on. Until that happens, a diary like this one exists in a strange kind of limbo, confirmed, real, catalogued precisely enough that anyone could find it, and yet functionally invisible to almost everyone who might want to know what Grace herself, in her own private words, actually thought about any of the life we've spent this evening reconstructing from the outside. That's not a criticism of the archive, or of South Dakota State University, or of anyone else. Reading rooms require staffing, appointments, sometimes travel across an entire state, or further. Most confirmed historical documents, for most people who aren't professional researchers, exist exactly this way. Real, findable, and unread, simply because reading them requires more effort than most of us will ever spend on any one person's life. However interesting that life turns out to be, Grace's diary is not unusual in that respect. It's simply one particular confirmed example of how much of the historical record actually works. There's something almost unbearably poignant about that folder sitting there, catalogued and waiting, holding Grace's own actual handwriting, her own actual private observations about years this account has only been able to reconstruct from the outside. Every hedge this account has carefully placed tonight, about Grace's feelings toward her marriage, toward caring for Mary, toward her own thinning place in her family's growing fame, might have an answer in that folder, in her own words, in her own hand. Or it might simply record weather and chores the way so many period diaries do. We don't know yet, and neither does anyone else. Either way, until someone actually makes that trip to Brookings, request in hand, we're left exactly where this account has left you all evening, knowing a great deal about what Grace did, and almost nothing about how she felt while doing it. That's not a failure of this particular account. It's simply the honest edge of what's currently possible, given what's been read and what hasn't. A folder, a locator, and a real diary inside it, waiting for the right person to walk into that reading room and finally turn its pages. It's worth remembering too that this diary has been sitting in that reading room, catalogued and accessible for years already. Nobody hid it. Nobody sealed it away. It simply sat there, correctly filed, waiting for someone with a specific enough reason to come looking. That's the quiet, unglamorous reality behind so much of what gets called lost history. Most of it was never lost at all. It was simply filed correctly and never requested. We're going to leave it there, unopened, for now, and turn instead to a different kind of trace, one that doesn't require a reading room appointment to describe, though it comes with its own honest limits all the same. A diary is one kind of survival, private and unread. What comes next is more public, catalogued in a different kind of institution entirely, and describable in far more detail, even without any special access required. It's also, in its own way, the most visual trace Grace left behind, since a photograph, unlike a locked folder of handwritten pages, can at least be described to you directly, in words, right now. The diary is not the only thing waiting in an archive. At the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, inside a collection built around Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's own daughter, sit 5 catalogued photographs connected to Grace. They're not scattered randomly through some general collection. They're specifically identified, given their own catalogue numbers, described in enough detail that we can tell you what each one shows, even without having seen the physical prints ourselves. One of them is a postcard photograph, dated to around 1908, showing Grace and Nate together. 3 more are portraits of Grace herself at various points in her life, and the 5th carries a title that stops you when you first read it: Grace and Nate Dow, labelled in the collection's own catalogue, Lost in the Snow. We should be careful here, genuinely careful, about what that title does and doesn't tell us. We don't know who wrote it, or when, or what specific moment or context it was meant to describe. It might refer to something as simple and literal as a snowbound photograph, a picture taken during a hard winter, nothing more poetic than that. It might carry some other meaning entirely, lost to whoever catalogued it decades after the fact. We're not going to tell you it means something profound about Grace's place in history, however tempting that reading might feel, sitting here at the end of an account about a woman history has, in its own way, half buried. It's simply a real catalogued title attached to a real photograph that happens to land with unusual weight given everything else this evening has covered. The other 4 photographs are more straightforward. Portraits, a record of Grace's actual physical presence across some stretch of her life, existing in an archive built primarily to preserve her niece's papers rather than her own. Grace's photographic record survives largely as a byproduct of someone else's collection, attached to the family history through Rose Wilder Lane's own materials rather than through any dedicated effort to preserve Grace's image specifically. Think about what that arrangement actually means. Grace Ingalls Dow doesn't have her own dedicated archive, built around her own life, the way her sister does. Her photographs survive because they happen to end up in her niece's papers that were preserved because Rose Wilder Lane herself became a notable enough figure to warrant careful institutional archiving. Grace's own image rode along, attached to someone else's importance, the same way so much of her documented life has come to us attached to her family's fame, rather than to any dedicated interest in her specifically. It's worth noticing, too, that a presidential library is an unusual place to find any trace of a small-town South Dakota farm wife at all. Grace never held office, never gave a speech, never did anything that would ordinarily earn her a folder in a collection built to honour a president. She's there only because Rose Wilder Lane kept her aunt's photographs among her own papers, and because Rose herself became prominent enough for an entire institution to preserve everything she'd kept. Grace rode into that archive on the coattails of her family's fame, the same way she's ridden into so much of the historical record this evening has managed to trace. There's a kind of fitting symmetry in that, whether or not anyone who catalogued those photographs ever intended it. Throughout this entire account, Grace's own record has survived largely as a byproduct of her family's larger story, an obituary that exists because she happened to be an Ingalls, a wedding announcement that exists because a small-town paper covered local news thoroughly, a letter that exists because her sister happened to need it. Her photographs, tucked into her niece's presidential library collection, are simply the latest example of that same pattern. 5 photographs, 1 diary, and a family reputation famous enough to carry a farm wife's image into a presidential library nearly a century after her death. That's an unusual kind of survival, but it's Grace's own particular kind, and it's just as real as any other. Somewhere among the archival holdings in West Branch, Iowa, where the Hoover Library stands, 5 small images of an ordinary South Dakota farm wife sit filed among the papers of one of the 20th century's more prominent literary daughters. Nobody planned for that arrangement specifically, and nobody needs to have planned it for it to be worth noticing. It's simply where Grace ended up, carried there by family connection, rather than by anything she did to earn that particular kind of preservation herself. None of these 5 items are necessarily available for you to view freely online today. Presidential libraries operate under their own rules about digitization, licensing and reproduction rights, and confirming exactly what's accessible and on what terms would require direct contact with the institution itself. What we can tell you, confidently, is that they exist, catalogued, described, and waiting in the same way Grace's diary waits in Brookings, real, findable, and only partially available to the kind of casual curiosity most of us bring to a story like this one. That's worth carrying forward as this account turns to its final piece of evidence, a letter second-hand, a diary, unread, photographs, catalogued but attached to someone else's collection. 3 real, confirmed traces, none of them gathered by anyone with Grace specifically in mind until quite recently. There's one more kind of trace left to walk through, and it isn't sitting in a folder or a photo collection at all. It's sitting in the work of historians themselves, people who've looked at exactly this same thin record and decided deliberately to try to thicken it. That effort turns out to be more recent and more directly relevant to tonight's own question than you might expect. Photographs in a diary are one kind of trace, scholarship is another, and it's more recent than you might expect. In 2021, the South Dakota Historical Society put together a presentation with a title that could double as this very account's own thesis statement: Finding Grace, the Lost Ingalls Sister, and the End of the Frontier. Real historians, working through a real institution, sat down and asked many of the same questions this evening has been asking about a woman whose own family helped make the 19th century Prairie famous, and who nonetheless remains one of its least documented figures. That presentation wasn't a one-off curiosity either. A few years later, in January of 2024, the same historical society's own academic journal, South Dakota History, published a research piece by 2 authors, Caroline Jones and Melanie Fishbane, titled Discovering Grace, Research Challenges in Finding the Lost Ingalls Sister. We should be honest about the limits of what we can tell you here. This account hasn't read that article in full. We haven't gone through its footnotes, its bibliography, or its complete argument page by page. What we can tell you, reliably, is what the Historical Society's own public summary says about its conclusions. According to that summary, the authors argue that Grace's spotty historical record reflects something bigger than one family's particular choices about what to write down and what to leave out. It reflects, in their words as summarized by the Society itself, a broader historical habit of treating women's lives as unimportant, a pattern that erases real people and their stories simply by not bothering to preserve them with the same care given to their more famous relatives. That's a significant claim, and it's worth being precise about what it does and doesn't prove. It doesn't prove that Laura specifically set out to erase her sister. It doesn't prove any individual person, publisher, or family member made a deliberate choice to keep Grace's story thin. What it does suggest, backed by actual historians doing actual research, rather than by this account's own speculation, is that Grace's case fits a recognized, broader pattern. Women's local, domestic, and personal records across this entire era survive far less completely than men's, and far less completely than anyone connected closely enough to eventual fame to have their early lives carefully preserved for that reason alone. Think about why that pattern exists in the first place. Men's public activities, land deeds, business dealings, elected offices, military service, generated official paperwork almost automatically, the kind that ends up preserved in courthouses and government archives simply because bureaucracies required it. Women's lives, especially in this era, generated far less of that automatic paper trail. Teaching, correspondence, household management, and family caregiving, exactly the roles Grace spent her adult life filling, simply didn't produce the same kind of institutional record a man's public career would have. It's not that anyone decided Grace's life mattered less. It's that the entire system for generating and preserving records was built around the kinds of activities men more typically engaged in. Think about what it means that this scholarship exists at all, and that it's this recent. Grace died in 1941. It took until 2021, 80 years later, for a dedicated historical presentation to be built specifically around the project of finding her. It took until 2024 for that work to reach a peer-reviewed academic journal. That gap, 80-some years between a woman's death and anyone mounting a serious named effort to recover her fuller story, tells you something all on its own about how thoroughly she'd receded from view in the meantime. This isn't proof that Grace was deliberately erased by anyone. It's evidence that she fits a pattern historians now recognise and are actively working to correct, one case at a time, hers included. And it's worth noticing that this correction is happening now, in your own lifetime, not in some distant academic past. Grace Ingalls Dow is, right now, actively being recovered, piece by piece, by people who decided her story was worth the considerable effort of gathering it. There's something worth sitting with in that fact alone. A woman who died in 1941, largely undocumented beyond her own family's papers and a handful of newspaper mentions, has become, in the 21st century, the specific subject of a historical society's presentation and a peer-reviewed journal article. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone at some point decided that the gap in Grace's record was worth naming and worth trying to close, the same instinct that eventually produced the account you're listening to right now. It's one voice added to a small, growing chorus of people who've looked at the same thin record this account has walked through and decided independently that it deserved more attention than it had been given. That's the state of the scholarship as it stands right now, honestly reported. Real, recent, still developing, and pointed directly at the same gap this evening has spent so long walking through. That chorus is still small, and the work is still early. A single presentation, a single journal article, this account tonight. It's not a finished project, and it isn't going to pretend otherwise. But it's a genuinely different situation than the one Grace's story sat in for most of the 80 years after her death, when almost nobody outside her immediate family was asking these questions about her at all. It's worth naming plainly what this recovery effort represents for a project like tonight's own telling. Every hedge, every "the record doesn't say," every unresolved chronology this account has carried across 3 long stretches of evidence sits inside exactly the same historiographical gap these researchers identified and set out to address. This account isn't operating in isolation. It's part of the same broader effort, arriving from a different direction, aimed at the same overlooked corner of a very famous family's history. It's worth remembering, too, that scholarship like this doesn't happen without someone first noticing the absence clearly enough to act on it. A historian has to look at a life like Grace's, see the thinness of the record, and decide that thinness itself is worth investigating, rather than simply accepting it as the natural, unremarkable state of things. That decision, made independently by researchers with no connection to this particular account, is itself a form of confirmation that the question this evening has been asking all along is a real and reasonable one to ask. That kind of independent confirmation matters more than this account's own conclusions ever could on their own. It's one thing for a single evening's storytelling to argue that Grace deserves more attention than she's received. It's another thing entirely for a state historical society and a peer-reviewed journal to have already reached separately much the same conclusion. So, what does scattered actually add up to? Think back over everything this evening has shown you. A letter, reproduced only second-hand, in which Grace supplied her sister with a childhood's worth of remembered wildflowers. A diary, real and confirmed, sitting in a folder in Brookings, unread by anyone connected to this account. 5 photographs, catalogued precisely, held in an archive built primarily around someone else's papers, and a body of real, recent historical scholarship built by actual historians who set out deliberately to recover more of Grace's story than had ever been gathered in one place before. None of these things on their own would add up to much. A letter here, a diary there, a handful of photographs, a research presentation, and a journal article. That's the actual, literal shape of scattered. Not one dramatic vault of lost material waiting to be discovered all at once, but small, real, confirmed pieces, sitting in different places, most of them barely touched. That's the difference between lost and scattered, and it's the truest thing this account can tell you about Grace Ingalls Dow. She was never actually missing. Her birth is on record, her marriage is on record, her teaching, her correspondent work, her caregiving, all of it survives somewhere, in outline if not in full detail. What was missing wasn't Grace herself. It was anyone with the time and the motivation to gather those scattered pieces into one continuous account, the way her sister's own life had been gathered, decade after decade, into books read by millions. Put the Wildflower letter back alongside all of this. It was never a grand literary collaboration, and this account has never claimed it was. It was one small, specific human exchange. A sister who needed something, and a sister who had it. That letter has sat quietly, second-hand and unconfirmed in its exact location, for the better part of a century, waiting the same way the diary waits in Brookings, the same way the photographs wait at the Hoover Library, the same way Grace's whole adult life has waited for someone to actually go looking. Set all four of these pieces side by side. A letter that shows Laura needing Grace, not the other way around. A diary that confirms Grace kept her own private record, even though we can't yet read it. Photographs that place her physically at specific moments across her married life. And scholarship that confirms, from outside this account entirely, that her thin record isn't unique to her, but part of a pattern historians are only now working to correct. 4 separate kinds of evidence, 4 separate institutions, and one consistent picture. A woman who was never actually gone, only spread thin across places nobody had yet thought to connect. That's the honest, complete answer this account can give to the question its own title asks. Grace wasn't lost. She was scattered, held in a folder in Brookings, a collection at the Hoover Library, a journal from South Dakota, and a second-hand letter about wildflowers, each piece real, each piece confirmed, and none of them until recently ever gathered into the same room. Notice, too, how differently each of these 4 traces is held. The letter survives only second-hand, its rights and original location unresolved. The diary is fully confirmed but entirely unread. The photographs are catalogued and described but not confirmed as freely reproducible. The scholarship is public and real, but this account has only its summary, not its full argument to draw on. 4 traces, 4 different levels of access, and not one of them offering the kind of complete, settled picture a more famous life would have produced by now. Gathering all of it here, tonight, into one continuous telling doesn't finish that work. It doesn't read the diary, doesn't secure the letter's rights, doesn't settle the unresolved sequence of her later years. What it does is exactly what this evening set out to do from its very first sentence. Take a woman the record has scattered thin, and hold her, for one telling, all in one place. Set that against the opening of this account. A baby born in a stretch her sister's book skip entirely has become, by the end of this evening, a woman with a confirmed birth, a confirmed marriage, a confirmed death, and 4 separate real archival traces still waiting for someone to connect them fully. That's not a thin life. That's simply a life whose fullness has taken this long, and this much gathering, to become visible again. That's as far as tonight's account can honestly take you. The rest, the unread pages in Brookings, the unresolved timeline, the questions no surviving source can answer, belongs to whoever picks up this work next. And someone will. Eventually. Scattered things can be gathered. Lost things, in the truest sense, cannot. And Grace Ingalls Dow was never in that second category, however much the surface of her thin record might have suggested otherwise at the start of tonight's telling. That gathering is only now beginning, through historians, through archives slowly opening their finding aids to researchers, through accounts like this one. Grace Ingalls Dow lived a full adult life, a teacher praised in print, a wife and farm partner through years of real hardship, a local writer whose actual words haven't yet been recovered, a caregiver to her sister, and, for one documented letter at least, the keeper of memories her famous sister genuinely needed. That life was never gone. It was simply waiting in pieces for someone to go looking. Which brings us back to where this account began. A rented brick house on the edge of a small Iowa town. A baby girl born in a stretch of family history her own sister's famous books would later skip right over. That was the literal shape of the question this evening set out with. What does it mean to be the sister the story almost left out? We can answer that now, more fully than we could at the start. It doesn't mean Grace was erased on purpose, by Laura or by anyone else. It doesn't mean her life was empty or thin or somehow less real for being less written about. It means Grace built an entire adult life, teaching, marriage, farm work, local writing, family care, using exactly the same kind of steady, practical resourcefulness her sister's books celebrate in every other member of this family. And it means that life survived afterward, the way most ordinary lives survive, scattered in pieces across letters and obituaries and archive folders, waiting for someone to gather it back together. That's the answer this evening set out to find, and it's a fuller, truer one than the simple word missing ever could have given you on its own. A woman whose own birth never made it into her family's famous story turned out to be the one holding a piece of that story her own sister needed and couldn't supply herself. Grace wasn't only the sister left out. For one documented, quiet exchange, she was the sister who remembered, somewhere tonight, in the places where Grace lived and taught, and in a folder in Brookings still waiting to be opened. Her life remains what it always was, real, full, and quietly waiting to be found. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this evening with a life that history nearly let slip past. Grace Ingalls Dow was real, she was capable, and her life reached far beyond the small place the famous books gave her. Good night.